A year ago, a man died because of his calculation. Now he was standing on the slope again. He had disabled the protection system himself. If he was wrong, the snow would have to cover the road the school bus would take in the morning. He waited. The mountain was silent. And then something hit dully beneath it. And at that moment, he realized he was afraid of the wrong thing again. The hum vibrated up through the soles of his boots, a sensation more felt than heard. It was a deep, steady pulse, like the heartbeat of some great machine. Ethan Cole stood on the dark slope, his gaze fixed on the tablet in his hands, its screen a harsh slash of light in the gloom. 6 below zero. Above the canyon, the star-filled sky was a flawless, frozen expanse. The snow underfoot was a solid, unbroken sheet, packed hard by the wind and cold. This was his third check this week, a routine that felt less and less so with each visit. The SEIF-SNOW installation thrummed 500 feet above him on the ridge. He could just make out its silhouette against the night sky, a metallic frame on a concrete platform, tangled in a web of thick cables. Pulsing blue indicator lights kept time with the deep vibration. The company called it acoustic snowpack stabilization, a benign term for a force that felt anything but. Ethan had checked the array of sensors last Tuesday and again on Friday. Now here he was again, a feeling of unease settling in his gut. The graph on his tablet suddenly jumped. He froze, his brow furrowing. It was a microseismic spike, a thin, sharp line like a needle's peak. The timestamp read 23:42. Just 5 minutes ago, the SEIF-SNOW unit had ramped up to full power. The timing was too perfect, a coincidence precise to the minute. Cole swiped a finger across the screen, zooming in on the data. The source coordinates pointed to Raven's Gulch, 2 miles to the northeast. A place that was supposed to be quiet, a place that shouldn't be speaking like this. The winter road to the Blackwood Mountain Academy wound its way directly through Raven's Gulch. He slipped the tablet into the deep pocket of his parka, standing motionless for a moment, letting the deep hum wash over him. The wind skittered loose snow across the icy crust at his feet. Far below, the lights of the Blackwood Peak Resort were a scattered chain of gold in the vast, dark bowl of the valley. He glanced toward the gulch, but the sharp crest of the ridge blocked it from view, hiding whatever secrets it held. It could be a normal response from the snow slab, he told himself. The deeper, compacted layers were known to react to harmonic vibrations. This was established science, nothing to be alarmed about. But a peak this sharp, at this exact moment. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it. This was starting to feel less like a coincidence and more like a conversation he was only just beginning to understand, and he didn't like what the data was telling him. The pattern was taking shape, and it was a disturbing one. The station was warm, the silence a stark contrast to the thrumming outside. Ethan hung his parka on a hook, kicked the snow from his boots, and sank into his desk chair. 12:20 in the morning. The water in the electric kettle was still hot. He poured a cup, dropped in a tea bag, and opened the digital archives on his computer. 2 months of system activations, 74 nightly sessions. He initiated a search, cross-referencing the timestamps of SEIF Snow's power-ups with any seismic anomalies recorded from Raven's Gulch. 59 matches out of 74 runs. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the number. 59 was not a random anomaly. It was a clear and undeniable pattern. The question was what it signified. He pulled up the draft of a model he'd started building last week. If the installation was emitting vibrational pulses, and the bedrock beneath the slope was geologically unstable, then the stress within the snowpack wasn't being dissipated. It was being displaced, redistributed along the terrain's weakest points. and one of those points was Raven's Gulch. He looked at the topographical map on the wall, marking the gulch with a red pin. Then he drew a straight line from the pin to the thin blue line representing the access road. A quarter mile. The school bus used that road every single morning. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and walked to the window. The slope was a formless white expanse in the darkness, ending where the resort's lower trail lights gave way to night. The installation continued its work, its hum too distant to hear, but its data streamed in, relentless and clear. He returned to his desk and initiated a preliminary forecast based on his new hypothesis. The program churned through the data, the progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. While it worked, he sketched a crude diagram on a notepad. Vibration source to weak zone to stress accumulation. It was just a theory, not a proven fact, but it was a theory that felt increasingly, dangerously plausible. Finally, the program spit out a result. The predicted amplitude of any potential shifts was moderate, well within the accepted margin of error. He could be wrong, but he could also be right. The next morning, he went to the administration building. Michael Shaw, the head of the Mountain Safety Division, saw him at 9. The office was small and functional. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and shelves of binders organized alphabetically. Shaw was standing by the window with a mug of coffee when Ethan walked in, staring out at the slopes as if he could see the weather forming. "Sit down," he said, his back still to the room. He sounded tired, a permanent state for him during the high season. Ethan took the seat and laid his printouts on the desk. The correlation graphs, the map with the highlighted zones, the draft of his displacement model. 59 correlations out of 74 system activations, he began, tapping the top sheet. Microseismic spikes in Raven's Gulch. The time window is plus or minus 7 minutes from SEIF-SNOW going online. This was the core of his concern, laid out in black and white, impossible to ignore. He waited, letting the starkness of the numbers sink in. Shaw finally turned around, his expression unreadable. He picks up one of the graphs, adjusting his glasses to study the sharp peaks. "This is correlation, Ethan," he said, his voice flat. "Correlation is not causation. We both know that." The dismissal was gentle, but immediate. He had heard this argument before, or one like it, and had already made up his mind. Ethan felt a familiar wave of frustration but pushed it down, focusing on the facts and the necessary next steps. "I understand that," Ethan replied, keeping his tone even. "That's why I'm saying we need to verify. A temporary shutdown of the installation for 48 hours, and we run a series of independent seismic readings." Shaw placed the sheet back on the pile, the gesture deliberate. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a sign of weariness Ethan knew all too well. "Ethan," he began softly, but Ethan cut him off, leaning forward to emphasize his point. "The Academy Road runs through that gulch." Silence filled the small office. Shaw slowly lowered himself into his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He folded his hands on the desk, his gaze distant. "Have you spoken to Sterling about this?" he asked, his voice low. "No, I came to you first." "Sterling is having his quarterly briefing here at 2. The company is presenting their performance data." Shaw looked down at the stack of papers. "Bring these with you. But I'm not submitting this as an official department request." Ethan gathered his papers and stood. "Michael," he started, but his boss cut him off. "Check your data again. Make sure your model is sound. Don't go into that meeting with half-baked calculations." It wasn't a dismissal, but it wasn't support either. It was a warning to be absolutely certain before he picked a fight with a man like Ryan Sterling, a fight he likely couldn't win. Sterling met him in a conference room at the Summit Lodge. The room was dominated by a large mahogany table, a high-end laptop, and a folder bearing the corporate logo. Ryan Sterling himself was immaculate in a dark navy suit, a man whose sharp, focused blue eyes seemed to look straight through you. He was the picture of corporate control and confidence, a man unaccustomed to being questioned. The mayor was with him. Mayor Peterson sat off to one side, looking out of place in a gray sweater worn over a collared shirt, holding a phone with a cracked screen. He didn't look up immediately when Ethan entered, his attention seemingly absorbed by the device in his hand. Ethan laid out his case concisely: the activation archives, the seismic correlations, the preliminary stress model, the location of the gulch, the school road. He kept his presentation factual, devoid of emotion. Sterling listened without a flicker of expression, his fingertips steepled. "We manage risk, Mr. Cole, not emotions," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as ice. "We have a comprehensive monitoring system in place." He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward Ethan. "Take a look." The displayed graphs were perfect. The amplitudes were normal, the stress dynamics a flat, steady line without a single aberration. Every monitored zone on the slope was highlighted in a reassuring green. Ethan stared at the screen, then at his own printouts, then back at the flawless data presented by Sterling. Something was wrong, but he couldn't immediately place it. The data was too clean, too perfect. "Where are the sensors for this data located?" he asked, his voice steady. "They're from the entire network, 15 monitoring points across the slope." "You don't have any sensors in Raven's Gulch," Ethan stated. It wasn't a question. A brief, almost imperceptible pause hung in the air. Sterling's expression remained unchanged. "Raven's Gulch is outside the project's designated operational area," he replied smoothly. "Our responsibility is the resort's main slope." It was a precise, legalistic answer that sidestepped the entire issue. They weren't monitoring the gulch because they didn't have to. The potential danger was, officially, not their problem. Mayor Peterson finally set his phone down on the table, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Ethan," he said, his voice quiet and edged with fatigue. "There have been no avalanches. The slope is stable. We're having the best season in 5 years. People have jobs. The restaurants are full." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Are you trying to shut down the season again?" The question was gentle, but the implication was clear. He was rocking the boat, threatening the town's fragile prosperity. Ethan met the mayor's gaze. Peterson looked at him, not with anger, but with the profound weariness of a man who had already made a difficult choice and was not prepared to revisit it. It was almost a plea. "I'm asking for a 2-day suspension of the installation," Ethan said firmly, "to conduct independent readings. It's standard procedure when an anomaly is detected." "There is no anomaly," Sterling cut in. "There are your calculations, which, with all due respect, appear to require further refinement." The meeting concluded with polite, empty phrases. Sterling assured him that the company was open to a constructive dialogue based on verified data. The mayor thanked him for the diligence of the Mountain Safety Division. Ethan walked out into the hotel corridor, the smell of the restaurant's breakfast service and drying ski boots thick in the air. The conversation was over, but nothing had been resolved. His concerns had been noted, filed, and dismissed. The face of a young skier flashed in his memory. 25, maybe? He'd found him in the snow at the very edge of an avalanche debris field. The data had looked borderline then, too. They had told him to wait and see. They waited. They saw. He wasn't going to let that happen again, not if he could help it. He knew what he had to do next. The official channels were closed. It was time to find his own answers. He went up the mountain again that night. Not for more data readings, but for physical samples. He needed to manually check the snowpack's density and layering near the installation's perimeter to definitively rule out a malfunction in his own equipment. If his sensors were faulty, it changed everything. And if they weren't, That changed everything too. He needed solid ground to stand on, one way or another. He climbed a maintenance trail, skirting the brightly lit main slope. The security fence for the SEIF-snow-restricted zone began just above the last ski lift. He reached the perimeter at 1:45 in the morning, the cold biting at any exposed skin. 2 figures were standing by the gate, their forms dark against the snow. They were waiting. "Hold it!" The first man stepped forward, his hands shoved into the pockets of a company-branded parka. "Restricted area." "Mountain safety," Ethan said, holding up his ID. "Routine sensor check." "Routine checks are scheduled through an official request. You got a request?" The man's tone was bored, dismissive. He was just doing his job. "This is an emergency inspection," Ethan countered, knowing it was a weak argument. "No request, no entry." The second guard was already moving to flank him, a silent, imposing shape. Ethan didn't back down. He took a determined step toward the gate, his mind racing. He just needed a few minutes, a few samples to confirm what he suspected. The first guard put a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't rough, but it was firm, an unyielding barrier. "I said the area's closed." "Take your hand off me," Ethan said, his voice low and tight. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a mix of adrenaline and frustration. The hand remained. Ethan tried to turn away, and in that instant, the second guard shoved him hard in the shoulder, a short, sharp jab. His boots slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. He lost his balance, his arms flailing, and crashed down onto the hard-packed snow. The analyzer was knocked from his grip, skittering across the ice before striking a rock at the edge of the path. The screen went dark. For a second, there was only silence, broken by the distant hum of the installation. The first guard stood over him, a dark silhouette against the indifferent stars. "Next time we call the sheriff," the man said, his voice flat, emotionless. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. "This is private property." He felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a cold sense of defeat. They were just following orders. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, a sharp pain flaring in his side. A bruised rib, maybe worse. It didn't matter. He picked up the dead analyzer. The casing was intact, but the screen was lifeless. 8 months he'd waited for the funding to get that piece of equipment. Without a word, the guards turned and walked back to their post at the gate, as if he had already vanished into the darkness. He made his way back down the slope in the dark, the steady, almost soothing hum of the installation following him like a mocking whisper. Back at the station, he didn't even take off his parka. He stood at his desk, flipped open his laptop, and pulled up the latest telemetry data from Raven's Gulch. A new reading, taken at 12:25. The amplitude had risen again, not by a few percentage points, but by whole integers. The increase was small in absolute terms, but it was consistent. Each activation didn't just produce a spike, it produced a slightly larger one than the last. He printed the last 3 graphs and laid them side by side. The first, the second, the third. The trend was unmistakable. No complex formula required to see it. This wasn't a stable correlation. It was a progression, a steady, relentless escalation. His own model had predicted a critical stress accumulation in 7 to 9 days at the current activation frequency, but the real-world amplitude was already outpacing his calculations. Either his model was missing a key variable, or the force at play was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Shaw asked him to come in first thing in the morning. He didn't look at Ethan until he was seated. Then he raised his head, his gray-brown eyes heavy-lidded and tired. "Sterling called," he said. "Last night." "I figured." "Ethan," Shaw began, adjusting his glasses, though they were already perfectly positioned. "I understand your position. I do. But you went up to the installation last night without authorization. That's a problem for the department. I was checking my sensors, Ethan countered. It's their territory. Legally, Shaw stated, then paused. If you make a scene now without solid, irrefutable proof, it's going to hurt the whole station, our funding, our reputation. You understand that, don't you? Ethan said nothing. Don't make this a public fight, Shaw said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Refine the model. Get more data. It was a plea to follow the rules, to work within a system that Ethan was quickly realizing was designed to protect itself, not the people on the mountain. He was being told to be quiet, to be patient, while every instinct told him that time was running out. The quiet hum from the ridge was beginning to sound like a countdown. That evening, Ethan ran an enhanced simulation. He fed it every piece of data he had: historical snowpack density, topographical relief maps, the full amplitude series from the last 8 weeks. The program took 40 minutes to process. While it ran, he stood at the window, staring at the distant lights of the town below, a fragile island in a sea of darkness. The answer, when it came, was chilling. The results appeared on the screen at 10:40. Critical stress accumulation in the Ravens Gulch area, 5 to 6 days. The probability of a major slide during the next significant seismic impulse, over 60%. The potential devastation corridor, the Academy Road, a quarter-mile stretch. He printed the calculations, the stark numbers feeling heavy in his hand. 60% wasn't a certainty, but it was far from a negligible risk. He remembered printing a similar calculation a year ago. The probability had been 53% then. They had told him to wait. He'd waited. A few days later, a slide had caught a young skier, and that had been that. He stuffed the printout into a folder, then pulled it out, then put it back again. A low humming vibrated through the window panes. The nightly activation of SEIF-SNOW, right on schedule at 23:05. 4 minutes later, his tablet registered the corresponding spike from Ravens Gulch. The amplitude was 8% higher than the previous night's reading. He closed the folder and stood up, pacing from his desk to the window and back. He stopped in front of the wall map, his eyes tracing the line from the red pin in the gulch to the road, to the small icon marking the academy. He was out of options. Official channels were a dead end. Shaw wanted him to stay quiet. Sterling controlled the narrative. Mayor Peterson wanted a thriving town, a desire so powerful it blinded him to the physics of the situation. If he was wrong, he'd lose his reputation, maybe his job. If he was right and did nothing, what happened last year would happen again. But this time, it would be a bus full of kids. He grabbed his parka and his pack. The flash drive with all his data was in an inner pocket where he always kept it. He checked the battery on his backup analyzer, fully charged. Outside, the air was sharp, 10 below. The slope above the town glowed with the installation's eerie blue lights. He stepped out and closed the door behind him. For 3 days, Ethan barely left the station. On the morning of the 4th, Michael Shaw called at 8:30. His voice was soft, cautious, the tone he always used when delivering bad news. Ethan, Sterling paid a visit to the county supervisor yesterday. A pause. You know what that means? I do. Don't escalate this. Just let the project run its course for the season. Cole didn't answer. He ended the call and set the phone on the corner of his desk, next to a stack of printouts. Through the window, he could see the lower ski run, the blue marker flags, skiers on the chairlift, an instructor in a bright orange vest. The town was alive. The town was celebrating the snow. And right now, he found that celebration deeply unsettling. He turned back to the screen. His stress redistribution model had been running all night. He'd already adjusted the snow slab density twice, factored in wind transport along the ridge, and nudged the temperature coefficient up by 0.5 point. The projected danger zone in Raven's Gulch had shrunk, but it hadn't disappeared. This could mean his hypothesis was robust, or it could just mean it was flexible. He hated confusing the two. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. A year ago, his calculations had also been flawless. 44% probability. He'd rounded that up to hazardous in his report. The official recommendation? Restrict access to the lower shoulder of the route. Shaw had signed off on it. The mayor had thanked him. Nobody closed a thing. 3 days later, a tour bus stopped near the edge of the debris field, and a young man in a red helmet walked up to get a picture of the gorge from above. The avalanche caught him less than 50 yards from the safe zone. Ethan had been the one to find him. A pale bluish hand clenched into a fist was sticking out of the hard-packed snow. He got up, poured a glass of water from the tap, and drank it down before returning to his desk. He stared at the model again. The graphs were too clean. He'd noticed it 3 days ago, but couldn't quite articulate it. Natural data never looked like this. It always had fractures, random spikes, asymmetry. These curves were smooth, polished, like something from a corporate PowerPoint presentation. Either the company was working with a perfectly uniform snowpack, which was physically impossible, or the data was being doctored. He opened a new file and started the recalculation from scratch, using only his own raw sensor feeds. By evening, things had gotten worse. His corrected model now showed the amplitude of potential shifts was well within the normal range. Not alarming, not critical, just normal. Ethan sat staring at the screen, at the numbers that refuted his own conclusions. He could be wrong. The thought was sharp and unwelcome. He didn't push it away. He'd learned long ago that ignoring an inconvenient idea was worse than investigating it. But that didn't make it any easier. He remembered the mayor's face, tired, without malice. He pulled an old flash drive of backup archives from his desk drawer and plugged it in. He opened the files from last season, data from November, December, early January. He found the measurement, 44%. He reviewed his methodology. The methodology was sound. The calculation was correct. But no one had made the decision to act. He closed the file. No. The problem wasn't a calculation error. The problem was that he couldn't see what was happening inside the installation itself. At 10:05 p.m., only a skeleton crew remained on the slope. Ethan watched the perimeter on the station's webcam for 20 minutes before heading out. 2 guards at the gate, both taking turns stepping into the warming hut. The interval was about 8 minutes. He grabbed his portable analyzer, the backup, a cheaper model with a small SSD for logs, a headlamp, a pair of thin, fingerless gloves for working a keyboard in the cold. He tucked the flash drive, looped on a lanyard, under his collar. This wasn't sabotage. It was verification. If the installation was operating as the company claimed, the data would confirm it, and he would write a formal letter of apology and close the case. If it wasn't, he would know for sure, not just based on correlations. The climb took 18 minutes. He skirted the lit area by way of a rocky spine where the snow was thin and didn't crunch underfoot. The SEIF-SNOW technical trailer stood about 20 yards from the main structure. It was a standard construction module, gray and windowless, with an intake vent on the roof. The lock was electronic with a keypad. A single security camera was mounted on the corner, but it was pointed at the gate, not at the trailer itself. Ethan circled around to the blind side and pressed his palm against the metal wall. The ventilation hummed steadily. The servers were running. He keyed in the standard technical code used by Mountain Safety for joint access sites. 3 seconds. The lock clicked open. Ethan stepped inside. Server racks lined the walls. 4 sections, each blinking with green status lights. In the center was a control console, a small monitor dark in sleep mode, its keyboard faintly backlit. To the left was a separate, standalone rack, secured with a different kind of mechanical lock. The cables leading from it didn't run up into the rack with the others, but down, disappearing through a rubber grommet in the floor. He took a step toward the console. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound was soft, but final, a heavy, mechanical thud. A red light blinked on a panel by the door. On the console, the monitor flickered to life, displaying a single line of text. Unauthorized access. Enter level 2 password. The standard code was useless here. He tried a common admin password. Access denied. The system was waiting for an 8-character alphanumeric string. He wasn't going to guess his way through that. He didn't waste time trying. He raised his headlamp and studied the separate rack on the left, a sealed cable housing, not standard for an acoustic system. Avalanche mitigation doesn't require an isolated, independently powered data channel. It adds cost, it adds complexity, and it adds a risk of discovery, if you have something to hide. He pulled out his analyzer and plugged it into one of the open ports on the main console. The operations log began to download. Slowly, the system's security only allowed access to the most recent, superficial layer of data, but it was enough. After 2 minutes, he had the frequency settings for the last 24 hours. The specified frequency in the documentation was 4 Hz. The actual operating values were 2.1, 2.3, 2.0, 2.2. A discrepancy of nearly 50%. Outside, he heard the crunch of footsteps on snow. 2 sets, moving fast. He yanked the analyzer free, spotted a red emergency lever at the bottom of the door labeled Fire Exit, and threw his weight against it. Flashlight beam across the cables. The flashlight beam across the cables. The floor grommet. The lock. The other was speaking into a radio. Ethan didn't move, his back cold against the metal. It was 5 below 0. 30 seconds later, the footsteps receded toward the gate. He waited another minute, then slipped away the same way he had come. Back at the station, he didn't bother to take off his parka. He went straight to his desk, plugged the analyzer into his laptop, and pulled up the log file. The installation's documented frequency was 4 Hz. Its actual operating mode was around 2 Hz. This wasn't a calibration drift or a margin of error. It was a different mode entirely, for a different purpose. He opened the microseismic archive from Raven's Gulch and overlaid the SEIF-SNOW activation timestamps. The synchronization was still there. It had been from the start. But now he was looking at the waveform, not just the timing. The signal from the gulch was in the 0.3 to 0.5 Hz range. It was heavy, slow, with a long trailing decay. A snow slab doesn't respond like that. It gives a short, sharp response. This signal was coming from deep within the earth. He leaned back. He got up, poured a mug of cold tea, and took a tasteless sip. He pulled a folder of archival materials from the shelf. He had officially requested the geological survey maps 3 weeks ago for updating the relief profile in the new seasonal report. They'd arrived without any questions. He hadn't paid them much attention at the time. He spread a 1 to 25,000 scale map across his desk. He located the coordinates for the SEIF-SNOW technical site. He traced a line with his finger toward Raven's Gulch. On the map, a thin, dashed line snaked beneath the slope. An exploratory survey line, dated 12 years ago. The license had expired. Its status was inactive. The coordinates of that line coincided almost perfectly with the epicenter of the microseismic activity. The margin of error was no more than a couple hundred yards. He stared at the map for a long time. The company had arrived 3 months ago with their infrastructure ready to go. The trailer, the cables, the system already assembled. A typical installation for acoustic stabilization takes 4 to 6 weeks. They had it done in 9 days. It wasn't a new installation. It was a connection to an existing point of access. At midnight, he decided to test his original hypothesis to its conclusion. Not because he still believed it. He didn't. But before moving forward, he had to close that door completely. If SEIF-SNOW really was transferring stress into Raven's Gulch, shutting it down would prove it. If not, the question would shift to an entirely new plane. He reached the technical zone at 12:45 a.m. The guards weren't at the trailer. After the false alarm, they had returned to the main gate. The system's master breaker was on an external panel on the module. Designed for emergency shutdowns, it required no password. Ethan flipped open the protective cover and pulled the heavy lever down. The hum ceased. It was instantaneous, as if a layer of sound had been surgically removed from the world. The silence on the slope felt different, heavier. Even the wind seemed quieter. The blue lights died. He stepped back from the panel and just stood there. The slope lay before him, a vast, white, motionless expanse. If he was right, the accumulated stress should now be released. The slab should break free. He stood, waiting for the catastrophe he believed he had set in motion. An hour passed, then a second. The snow did not move. He was sitting on a rock near the generator frame, his parka zipped to his chin, his hands deep in his pockets. It was 8 below. The sky over the ridge was shifting from black to a deep, dark blue. The sensors on his tablet showed complete slope stability. He stood up, his knees cracking, and began the descent. He had been wrong. Not fundamentally. He had tested his theory to its end, and that was important. But his stress redistribution model was incorrect. The installation was not loading the gulch. If the spikes continued, the source was something else entirely. Back at the station, he immediately pulled up the real-time monitor. Raven's Gulch, 0047. A spike, small but clean. Frequency, 0.4 Hertz. Ethan slowly straightened up in his chair. The installation was off. The slope was silent. There was no vibration, no acoustic input from above, and yet the signal was still there. He opened the archive for the last 24 hours and isolated the night, a period with no skiers or snowmobiles. He filtered out all the surface noise. Only one signal remained. Slow, rhythmic, with pauses of about 20 minutes. He opened a second monitor. A library of acoustic signatures from mining operations. He downloaded it during an internship in Norway, thinking it might be useful for monitoring controlled avalanche blasting. He initiated a correlation search. The program ran for 4 minutes. The result? A 73% match with the signature of a controlled subterranean blast. The profile indicated a low-yield, possibly directional charge. Estimated source depth between 150 and 250 feet. He sat perfectly still. 73% wasn't absolute proof, but it wasn't a margin of error either. He turned back to the geological map. The survey line under the slope, the expired license, the SEIF-SNOW trailer with its separate secure cable rack, the cables disappearing into the floor. The operating frequency, half of what was documented. It wasn't acoustic stabilization, it was acoustic masking. He slowly drew a pencil line on the map from the seismic epicenter to the survey line. The distance was less than 200 yards, well within his instrument's accuracy, well within the realm of possibility. He had never investigated underground explosions before. He was an avalanche specialist. He worked with snow, pressure, and terrain. He didn't have the tools for this next step, and his confidence was shaken by a hypothesis that had just been completely upended. But the signal was there. With the installation off, it was still there. That was a fact, not a model. He put the map away, gathered his printouts, and opened a new document. He began to record his methodology, step by step, without conclusions, just data and sources. Timestamps, coordinates, frequencies, correlation values. If he was going to take this any further, he needed a chain of evidence that was unbreakable. Outside, the sky over the ridge was turning gray. Somewhere in the town below, the first snowmobile of the day sputtered to life, a faint echo through the double-paned glass. He looked up from the screen. The hum wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from below. The signal from Raven's Gulch lay on the screen, motionless, like a captured insect. Ethan set the data smoothing to 0. The program displayed the raw signal, unprocessed, showing the full frequency range from 0 to 20 Hz. Most analysts never looked at data this way. It was too noisy, too hard to read. But the shape was hidden in that noise. He moved the cursor over the first impulse. The wavefront was sharp, almost vertical. The decay tail was long and deep, with several echoing aftershocks. A snow slab doesn't respond like that. It produces a broad, soft impulse because it's a loose medium that dampens energy. This signal was coming from something dense. He opened a second tab. An archive of industrial seismology, mines, quarries, construction blasting in mountainous regions. He'd downloaded the database back in Norway, thinking it might be useful for comparing controlled avalanche work. He started a manual correlation, not with the software, but line by line. It was slower, but more reliable. The similarity appeared on the third iteration, the waveform from Raven's Gulch, and a waveform from a directional quarry blast in the database, a 12-year-old recording from West Virginia, low yield. They weren't identical, but they were close, too close to be a coincidence. He leaned back and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This wasn't snow. It wasn't the slab reacting to the installation's vibration. The source was deep underground, where the snow load was completely irrelevant. He took a clean sheet of paper and wrote down his conclusion in sharp, angular letters. Then he closed the notebook. The night he'd shut down SEIF-SNO had given him clean data, free from the machine's background hum. Now he returned to those recordings. He opened the archive from that night. He filtered out all surface noise, the whisper of shifting snow, the wind along the ridge, the thermal contraction of cables. What remained was the pure signal from the gulch. He went through it step by step, marking each impulse with a timestamp. First impulse, 0047. Second, 0108. Third, 0129. The interval was 21 minutes, plus or minus 30 seconds, as regular as a clock. He recalculated the delay between the readings of his two different seismographs, the main one and an auxiliary unit installed last year at the lower edge of the gulch. The difference in the wave's arrival time gave him speed and distance. He scribbled the formula on a piece of paper and plugged in the values. Source depth, between 550 and 700 feet. The margin of error was about 60 feet in either direction. Snow could not physically generate a signal like this. This was geology, not glaciology. It was his field, but from the other side, not the slope, but the rock beneath it. He double-checked the math. The result didn't change. He stood and paced the room. Through the window, a gray dawn was breaking over the ridge. Ethan leaned back and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This wasn't snow. It wasn't the slab reacting to the installation's vibration. The source was deep underground, where the snow load was completely irrelevant. He took a clean sheet of paper and wrote down his conclusion in sharp, angular letters, the pressure of the pen digging into the page. Then he closed the notebook. The night he'd shut down SEIF-Snow had given him clean data, free from the machine's background hum. Now he returned to those recordings. He opened the archive from that night. He filtered out all surface noise, the whisper of shifting snow, the wind along the ridge, the thermal contraction of cables. What remained was the pure signal from the gulch. He went through it step by step, marking each impulse with a timestamp. First impulse, 0047. Second, 0108. Third, 0129. The interval was 21 minutes, plus or minus 30 seconds, as regular as a clock. He recalculated the delay between the readings of his two different seismographs. He scribbled the formula on a piece of paper and plugged in the values. Source depth, between 550 and 700 feet. The margin of error was about 60 feet in either direction. Snow could not physically generate a signal like this. This was geology, not glaciology. It was his field, but from the other side, not the slope, but the rock beneath it. He double-checked the math. The result didn't change. He stood and paced the room. Through the window, a gray dawn was breaking over the ridge, and the first lights of the chairlift flickered on. He returned to his desk. The calculation had been double-checked. This was no longer a hypothesis. It was a result. Now he had to do something with it. He took his printouts, squared the pages into a neat stack, and began to build a comparative table. On the left, the timestamps of the SEIF-SNOW activations over the last 8 weeks. On the right, the microseismic peaks from the gulch. In a third column, he made a special note. The night the installation was off. The signal had continued. The table filled 3 pages. He stapled them together, writing comparative analysis and the date on the top sheet. A strange, almost physical sense of relief washed over him. The picture was finally complete. The data formed a clear, traceable chain of evidence that could be explained, followed, and presented. All he had to do was take it to Shaw, to the mayor, to Sterling. Show them the calculations. The professionals would understand. Rationality would prevail. He put the folder in his backpack and pulled on his parka. The town administration building opened at 9. Ethan arrived at 9:12. Anna at the front desk looked up from her paperwork as he walked in. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, though they'd seen each other several times. "No, I need to see Michael Shaw." She glanced at his backpack, at the folder in his hand, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly. "One moment," she said, and picked up the phone. Shaw saw him 5 minutes later. His office was on the first floor, at the end of the hall. It was a small room with shelves of binders and a clean desk. Michael Shaw was standing by the shelves with a mug of coffee, though he wasn't drinking it. He turned as Ethan entered. Ryan Sterling was standing by the window. He was wearing a branded SEIF-SNOW jacket, his hands in his pockets, his cold blue eyes calm, almost lazy. He watched the street for another second before turning, as if tearing himself away from a more important thought. "Cole," Shaw said, "we were expecting you." It was a lie, and Ethan knew it. But the words were delivered evenly, without irony or threat, just a hollow formality. Sterling didn't bother with a greeting. Ethan laid the folder on the desk and opened it. The depth calculation, the comparative table, the correlation with industrial seismology. 3 pages, neatly stapled. "I analyzed the signal from Raven's Gulch without any data smoothing," he said. "The waveform is consistent with a low-yield, directional subterranean blast. The source is 500 to 700 feet deep. The snowpack cannot generate a signal like that. There is blasting work being conducted under the slope." Shaw picked up the top sheet, adjusted his glasses, read it, and put it back down. Sterling hadn't moved. Say that again, Sterling said. Ethan repeated himself, more concisely this time. Source depth, waveform, comparative seismic archives. The discrepancy between the installation's documented and actual operating mode. The signal's independence from the SEIF-SNOW system. Sterling listened without interruption, his fingertips steepled. He looked at the folder, then at Ethan. You had access to our equipment logs, Sterling stated. It wasn't a question. I used the standard Mountain Safety Technical Code for joint access sites. It's routine access. You were in our technical trailer without notification and without the permission of our staff, Sterling continued, his voice perfectly level. At night. After which you shut down the system that ensures the safety of this slope. It was a diagnostic test, an emergency shutdown procedure. That's not a serious defense. Sterling's voice hadn't changed. He said it as calmly as he might say the weather or Thursday. But there was a finality in his tone, like a door being closed without a sound. Shaw was shuffling through the pages in the folder, his eyes downcast. Michael, Ethan said, turning to his boss. The signal continued that night, when the installation was off. I can show you the recording. I've seen it, Shaw answered quietly. And? A pause. Shaw placed the folder on the desk, carefully aligning the edges. Let's not jump to conclusions, he said, his voice soft and raspy. Your correlation method requires verification. It's not an official methodology for seismological monitoring. It's standard practice in industrial seismology. You're an avalanche specialist, Ethan, not a mining engineer. Sterling pushed himself away from the window, taking 2 steps toward the desk. The company takes matters of safety very seriously, he said. Therefore, I am obligated to report the fact of your unauthorized access to our equipment and the willful deactivation of a critical monitoring system. This is a violation of our joint infrastructure agreement. Our legal team will be reviewing the matter of damages and potential interference with operational processes. Ethan stared at him. Sterling hadn't raised his voice. He spoke slowly and clearly, as if dictating for a record. You're conducting blasting without a license. We have a full set of permits. Sterling opened a folder he'd been holding and placed several documents on the desk. Authorization for geotechnical surveying, an agreement with the town administration, full insurance coverage. Everything is by the book. Geotechnical surveying is not a permit for blasting. That's a discussion for the regulatory agencies, Sterling replied smoothly. Not for late-night visits to our equipment. Shaw cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Ethan, he said, finally looking up. His gray-brown eyes were tired, devoid of anger. Do you understand what's happening with this resort? This season? It's the first profitable season in 4 years. People are working. We have funding. We have this partnership. We have reporting to the state. The road to the academy runs through that gulch. Shaw looked away. I am requesting an independent review, Ethan said. A third-party geological assessment. 2 weeks. The slope can remain open. Sterling gathered his papers. If you submit an official request, the company will provide all the necessary documentation, he said, zipping his folder. But this freelance investigation is over. If you are seen near our infrastructure again without authorization, this will cease to be a disciplinary issue. He walked out without hurrying. The door closed softly behind him. Ethan looked at his folder. 3 pages of calculations. He put them away. Michael, he said. Go home, Ethan. In the lobby, Ethan stopped in front of the information kiosk. A banner took up half the wall. A strategic partnership, Blackwood Peak and SEIF-SNOW. Investing in safety. Investing in the future. Below the text were the company logo and the town crest, printed side by side, the same size. Below that was a photo. Mayor Peterson shaking hands with a man in a suit. In the background, a brand new chairlift. He remembered Shaw mentioning the upgrades back in October. The funding was from the town, but with partial co-investment. SEIF-SNOW had put money into the resort. In return, the resort gave them a prime location on the mountain. A location and something else. If he raised the issue of illegal blasting now, the entire arrangement would collapse. Not just the technical project, the entire town budget, all the backroom agreements. Shaw wasn't stalling out of incompetence. He understood exactly what was at stake. He was making a choice. Ethan stepped outside. The cold hit him instantly. 2 below, with a wind coming off the ridge. He walked past the parking lot, past a cafe with fogged-up windows. The sidewalks were filled with tourists carrying skis, instructors in bright jackets. Just another day. Back at the station, he took off his parka and sat down. He opened the archive from the night of the shutdown one more time, staring at the signal from the gulch when the installation was off. The impulses were steady. 0047, 0108, 0129. Then he opened the archive from a normal night, when SEIF-SNOW was running. He overlaid the timelines. The blast impulses were there, in both archives. But in the one with the installation running, they were drowned in the machine's acoustic background noise. The vibration from SEIF-SNOW created a broadband hum in the 1 to 5 Hz range. The signature of the blasting operations fell squarely within that range. The signal wasn't gone. It was being masked. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the graph. The mechanism was simple, almost elegant. The installation generated an acoustic smokescreen that obscured the deep seismic activity. Any monitoring operator would look at the signal and see the normal operating noise of an avalanche mitigation system. No suspicious peaks, no questions. He himself had been looking at this data for 3 weeks, seeing a correlation, but attributing it to the installation's effect on the snow. He had been fighting a ghost, building models for a phantom stress that didn't exist. And all the while, they were blasting rock under the mountain, 600 feet below the surface, 600 feet from an exploratory survey line marked on a 12-year-old map as inactive, 600 feet from whatever the company had found under the slope, and they had found it long before they ever came here with their avalanche system. He opened the table of timestamps and drew arrows. Every single blast occurred during an active phase of SEIF-SNOW. Not one during a maintenance break, except for the one night he had shut it down himself, never suspecting the work would continue without its cover. That was when the signal had become clear. That was when he had finally seen the shape of the wave. They never expected anyone to turn off the machine. He stood and walked to the window. The slope lay in the cold morning light, pristine, smooth. Blue trail markers, red instructor jackets. The chairlift cabins ascended slowly, smoothly. Beyond the ridge lay Raven's Gulch, and beyond that, the road to the academy. Underneath it all, explosions. He hadn't been fighting an avalanche. He hadn't been fighting an installation. He hadn't understood what he was fighting until the system itself had shown him its true face. A week ago, he thought stress redistribution was threatening the snowpack. They had used his own professional diligence to keep him trapped inside a false hypothesis: snow, slope, vibration. While he was modeling snow pressure, they were drilling under the mountain for avalanches. Nobody was looking any for avalanches. Nobody was looking any deeper. The avalanche specialist was the face of their safety program, a living showcase. He was being used. He returned to his desk. The folder with his calculations lay on the edge. 3 pages that had made no impression in Shaw's office. Sterling had anticipated the conversation. He'd immediately changed the subject to trespassing. Shaw had backed him up, not because he didn't understand the data, but because he understood the consequences. They had both made their choice. Ethan looked at the map on the wall, the red dot on Raven's Gulch, the vector to the road, a quarter mile. The school bus left from the academy every morning at 7:45. There was no one left in this town who was willing to listen to his calculations. Shaw called the next morning, before Ethan had even taken off his parka. "Get in here," he said. The words were curt, without preamble. That alone was a bad sign. The head of the division's office looked different at 8 in the morning. The desk was clear. The binders were neatly arranged on the shelves. Michael Shaw was sitting upright, wearing a blazer, a rare sight so early in the day. He adjusted his glasses as Ethan walked in, though they were already perfectly straight. "Sit down." Ethan sat. Shaw spent a moment fussing with a blank sheet of paper that lay before him. "Yesterday was difficult," he began, his voice soft, without judgment. "Sterling called me after you left. He's upset." "I can imagine." "Ethan, listen." Shaw pushed the sheet of paper aside. "I know you see a problem. I've known you a long time. You're not someone who raises alarms for no reason. But the way you're going about this, I'm bringing you data. You're bringing me data that demands we shut down this town's only source of income," Shaw countered, his voice low. He paused. "This department runs on state subsidies. If the county pulls our funding, we lose 3 positions. We can barely keep the staff we have." Ethan watched him, but his boss wouldn't meet his gaze. "They're calling it a sensor malfunction," Ethan said flatly. "I heard. Do you believe that?" The pause stretched. Shaw adjusted his glasses again. "I believe we need to solve this internally," he said finally. "There are protocols, an official request for an independent review, coordinated with the administration. We do it by the book, quietly. While we're working by the book, they're still blasting." "Ethan." A deep weariness had entered his voice. Not anger, just exhaustion. "Don't take this public. That's a personal request. From me to you." Ethan stood up. "I hear you, Michael." He left without another word. A new notice was pinned to the station's bulletin board, a simple printout, no letterhead. "To all staff, in light of recent inquiries, we ask that you please refrain from making public statements regarding joint venture projects until the completion of an internal equipment audit." No signature, no date. Ethan tore the sheet from the board, stared at it for a moment, and then dropped it on his desk. An internal equipment audit. An elegant solution. Sterling had chosen the right weapon. Don't question the data, question the source. If Ethan Cole's equipment was unreliable, then his calculations were invalid. It wasn't a refutation. It was character assassination by proxy. He sat at his computer and opened his calibration logs. Both seismographs, the primary and the auxiliary, had been certified in October, valid for another year. The analyzer that had been smashed on the rock during the confrontation with the guards hadn't been used in any of his recent calculations. All his data had come from perfectly functional, certified instruments. He could prove it. But to whom? That evening, at the cafe near the base station, Martha Hayes, the school bus driver he sometimes saw in the academy's parking lot, was talking with 2 other women. She spotted him as he walked by. "Hey, Ethan," she called out loudly through the open doorway. "Heard you've been busy crawling all over that mountain again." He stopped. "Just work," he said. "Good for you," Martha said, her tone confident, not accusatory. "I drive my kids through that gulch every morning, and every morning I look up at that snow and wonder." "You're keeping an eye on things up there, right?" "I'm watching," he confirmed. She nodded, as if that were all the reassurance she needed, and turned back to her conversation. Ethan walked on. The SEIF-SNOW system activated at 2300, right on schedule. He sat before his monitors, watching the real-time graph. The hum of the installation was inaudible from this distance, but his instruments read it clearly. A broadband noise between 1 and 4 hertz, as steady as a sleeping machine. 18 minutes later, the first impulse came from the gulch. Its shape was unchanged, but its amplitude had jumped by 12% compared to the average over the last 2 weeks. He noted the value. He opened a theoretical void density calculation based on the estimated volume of the blasts and typical rock characteristics. It wasn't critical yet. The threshold for a structural failure was still a ways off. But a 12% increase today meant another 12% next week. This wasn't going to be a sudden catastrophe. Sudden catastrophes are loud. They get prevented. A slow one gets ignored until it's undeniable. He closed the forecasting program and opened a folder of public documents. He found the budget transfers in the town's open financial reports, published online quarterly without commentary. 3 line items: project co-investment, infrastructure modernization, and geotechnical support. The amounts were vague, but the dates were not. December, January, early February. December, the first activation of SEIF-SNOW. January, the first significant rise in amplitude. Early February, the appearance of guards at the technical trailer. He cross-referenced the dates with equipment delivery manifests, which were stored in a shared log of all vehicles entering the resort, a log he had access to as a partner agency. 3 deliveries. The first in late November before the launch, standard acoustic system components. The second in mid-December, consumable materials for geotechnical survey. The third in January, specialized measurement and control equipment. Geotechnical surveys don't require consumables on that scale. Blasting operations do. On the days of the second and third deliveries, the deep signal from the gulch had intensified. Not sharply, but smoothly, by 8 to 10%. And on those exact days, SEIF Snow had been running at maximum power. He printed 3 pages and stapled them to his spectral graphs. Mayor Peterson called him directly. Ethan hadn't expected that. The mayor always went through Shaw. "Ethan," he said, his voice as gravelly as ever. Tired. "Let's meet. No Sterling. Just you and me. No papers." "When?" "Tomorrow at 11. My office." Ethan arrived on time. The mayor's office overlooked the main plaza. The base of the chairlift was clearly visible from the window. The cabins moved up the mountain in a steady, endless chain. The town was working. Peterson was standing by the window. He didn't turn immediately when Ethan entered, but waited another second before pointing to a chair. "Sit." He sat opposite him, rubbing his chin. "Sterling says he's preparing an official report on your sensors," he said. "I'm not going to sign it." Ethan waited. "But I am asking you to stop," the mayor continued. "Not because you're wrong. Maybe you're right. I'm not a geologist. I don't understand frequencies and amplitudes. But I understand what will happen to this town if the resort closes. The road to the academy goes through that gulch." "I've heard that 3 times now." Peterson's voice didn't rise, but a new hardness entered it. "That bus has been driving that road for 20 years. There's never been a major slide." "They weren't blasting under the slope before." "Ethan." The mayor folded his hands on the desk. A ring on his right hand caught the light. "I pulled this town out of debt. 6 years ago, 4 businesses closed down. People were leaving. I had a choice: wait for a miracle, or take the deal that was on the table. I took the deal. If this falls apart now, the town will be gone in a year. That's not an abstraction. That's reality. Ethan looked at him. Mayor Peterson wasn't lying, and that was the heart of the problem. I understand what you're trying to protect, Ethan said. Then help me find a way to solve this internally, without federal investigators, without reporters. We can demand Sterling halt operations pending an expert review, quietly, no publicity. He's already shown us how his version of quietly works, Ethan replied. The mayor looked away. Outside, the chairlift cabins continued their steady, relentless ascent. Mayor Peterson, Ethan said, if the voids under that slope reach a critical point, it won't happen right now. It'll be in a month, or 3, in the spring. The snow will melt, the load will shift, and then it will look like a natural rock slide. Maybe it will be a natural rock slide. No. Silence. Go home, Ethan, the mayor said quietly. I've heard you. Back at the station, Ethan opened a new document. He titled it, Technical Report, Microseismic Monitoring of the Ravens Gulch Zone, Observation Period, November to February. He wrote methodically. Every point was backed up with a date, a data source, a calculation, and a link to the raw archive file. He never used words like crime or intent, only data, values, methodology, conclusion. 15 pages. He read it 3 times, correcting 2 typos. He attached the table correlating financial transactions with site activity, copies of the logs from the trailer, the printout of the spectral correlation with the industrial seismic database, and the calibration certificates for both of his instruments. In a separate file, he included the geological map with the survey line and the coordinates of the signal's source. He put a flash drive with a copy of the entire archive into the inner pocket of his parka. At 10:40 p.m., he opened his web browser. He found the contact information for the Bureau of Land Management. Then, the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration. 2 different agencies, 2 different email addresses. He composed 2 separate emails, tailoring the cover letter for each, focusing on their specific jurisdictions. The first, Resource Management, Unlicensed Blasting, Violation of Land Use Permits. The second, Industrial Safety, Risk of Subterranean Void Formation near a residential area, Threat to Public Infrastructure. He didn't see anyone. He read both emails one last time. He changed a single phrase in the second one, replacing suspected operations with recorded signals consistent with the characteristics of blasting operations based on instrumental monitoring. More precise, no speculation. He sent the first. A 5-second pause. He sent the second. The screen didn't change. The sent icon blinked once. The silence outside was absolute. Seif-Snow was not running tonight, or hadn't started yet. He checked his watch. 23:05. 7 days later, 2 men arrived in Blackwood Peak. They weren't reporters. They were quiet, dressed in gray jackets, and carried briefcases. They went straight to the administration building. Ethan saw their unmarked sedan parked out front. An hour later, Sterling emerged from the same building. He wasn't wearing his SEIF-SNOW jacket, but a tailored overcoat, a phone pressed to his ear. He walked quickly, his eyes fixed straight ahead. By noon, 2 resort employees were standing at the base of the chairlift with a sign that read, Technical Maintenance. The lift had stopped, cabins dangling halfway up the mountain. Confused tourists milled about below. An instructor in an orange vest was shrugging helplessly. Shaw called at 3:30. Do you understand what you've done? He asked. His voice was soft, but it held a new kind of weariness, not from a long day, but from something deeper. Yes, Ethan answered. They're going to audit us, too. Our documentation, our reports, our signatures on the joint venture agreements. I knew they would. Ethan. A long pause. You're fired. The order was signed today. Insubordination, causing reputational damage to the department. Another pause. I'm sorry. I hear you, Michael. He hung up. At the corner store, a woman who lived in his building recognized him. She met his eyes for a second, then looked away without a word of greeting. The people in line behind him were whispering. He heard the word scandal once, then the resort, lost shifts because of him. He bought a loaf of bread and left. The following week, the commission expanded. Geologists arrived with their own equipment, with drill rigs for taking core samples. Work on the slope was officially halted. They found evidence of unauthorized excavation beneath the slope. 3 voids, at depths between 600 and 700 feet. The size wasn't critical. Yet. The town's online forums were buzzing. "Who called DC?" was the title of one thread. 4 people posted Ethan's name. A few others replied that you don't do things that way, that there were proper channels, that he should have tried to work it out first. Martha Hayes called him herself. "Ethan," she said, her voice loud as ever, "I heard they let you go." "They did." "Right." A pause. "I just wanted to tell you one thing. I drive that gulch every day, with a bus full of kids. I don't know a thing about your frequencies, but I know that if they'd closed that road after something happened, it would have been a hell of a lot worse." She hung up before he could reply. On the morning the commission finished its preliminary work, Ethan walked out onto the slope. Not with equipment, no tablet. He just put on his parka, his fingerless gloves, out of habit, and started up a side trail. The snow was dense and still. Above the ridge, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the color it only got on the coldest, calmest days. The chairlift was idle, the slope was empty. He climbed to a point where, on a clear day, you could just see the winter road to the academy, a thin ribbon below, running between the gulch and the forest. The bus would be on that road at 7:45, just like always. The snow lay quiet. No movement, no sound. The slope wasn't threatening or protecting. It just was. A vast, white mass under a blue sky, indifferent to everything that happened below. Ethan stood and looked down at the road. The noise had never been coming from above. The snow had been innocent all along.